I'm really sorry we weren't able to release this episode last week as planned. I know we've been a bit erratic with releasing episodes, but we'll try and be more consistent. But I hope everybody is subscribed to Scottish Murders so you don't miss any new episodes when they do get released. So just a wee update about what I've been up to. Last week, myself and Marty from the Mums, Mysteries and Murder podcast recently were invited by Katie McGrath to attend Airdrie Library for their monthly Killers and Coffee event. And we actually did our first ever live recording, where we told the case of the murder of Aileen Printy in 1981 in Edinburgh, which was a case suggestion by one of our listeners. But for the life of me, I cannot find the message that was sent. Honestly, the older I get, the worse my memory and organisational skills get. So if it was you that wrote in and recommended that we cover the Aileen Printy case, please message me again so I can give you a proper shout out when we release the episode. But thanks again so much for suggesting the case. I hadn't heard of it before, and it does raise so many questions, despite many believing, including the police, that the case is closed. It was the perfect case to cover at Airdrie Library, and we had such a fantastic time. Everyone was so welcoming and really engaged so much with the case. There were so many theories, suggestions and opinions shared and discussed around the case. We can't thank everyone who was at the Killers and Coffee event for our live recording enough, for being so friendly and welcoming, for all your support, as Marty and I were pretty nervous, and for being so open to us recording your questions and thoughts. We'll be releasing that episode at the end of July, so again, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss this super special episode. Now, on to this week's case. Just before today's case, as you know, Scottish Murders has been part of the Darkcast network for quite some time now, and the network is constantly adding new and binge-worthy podcasts with a bit of a dark side. One new podcast to the Darkcast network that I wanted to tell you a bit about is called Box in the Basement, which is an investigative series created by Arlene, whose life was forever changed by a family tragedy. The tragedy being the unsolved murder of her uncle Leon Laurelis. Arlene decided to create this podcast, Box in the Basement, as she was disturbed by the lacklustre investigation into her uncle's death and the mystery that still surrounds this case. In this podcast, Arlene does a deep dive into the details surrounding her uncle's story and murder, uncovering many problems with the investigation. However, Arlene doesn't stop there. She not only covers the tragedy of her uncle's murder in Box in the Basement, but also other unsolved cases in Central Texas, in the hope of finding answers and getting justice in the overlooked and forgotten cases in her local community. This is such a compelling podcast, and I've been enjoying listening to it and wanted to share it with you. So if you're all caught up with your other podcasts and looking for another podcast to binge, then go and have a listen to Box in the Basement. So this week's episode is the murder of 30 or 31-year-old Elizabeth Campbell in 1932 in Cowcaddens in Glasgow. Elizabeth, or Lizzie Campbell, was blind in her right eye and deaf in one ear, and her family had been stricken with great misfortune over the years. According to an article in The Scotsman on the 1st of February 1932, 8 years prior to Lizzie being found murdered, Lizzie's mum had died suddenly, and shortly afterwards Lizzie's father apparently fell down in the street, receiving head injuries, and he died shortly thereafter. 2 years later, Lizzie's youngest brother, Thomas, apparently fell against an electric box and again died from head injuries. And then, not long after that, another of Lizzie's brothers, Joseph, died from pneumonia. Upon Lizzie losing her mother and father in quick succession, she moved in with her elderly Uncle Thomas and Aunt Margaret at their home in Weems Street, Cowcaddens in Glasgow. At the time of Lizzie's murder, she was not only working full-time for a firm of confectioners in Port Dundas, which is about a 17-minute walk northeast of where she lived in Kilcaddens, and she was reported to thoroughly enjoy this job, she was also working, and had been for some months, on weeknights and Saturday afternoons, cleaning offices on Hope Street for her aunt, as her aunt had been in ill health for some time and had been unable to keep up her cleaning duties. And so, on Saturday the 30th of January 1932, Lizzie sat down for lunch with her family, as usual, telling them that she planned to go out that night to the cinema with her friend, Betty, and so she would be back from her cleaning job about 5 p.m. After clearing up after lunch, Lizzie then left her home about 3 p.m. and made her way to Hope Street, no more than a 10-minute walk away, to clean the offices of Messrs. Farquharson Brothers, who were dealers in carbon papers and typewriter ribbons. At 5 p.m. prompt, Betty arrived at Lizzie's home, ready for heading out to the cinema. Lizzie's aunt and uncle told Betty that Lizzie wasn't back yet, but that she wouldn't be long, and they told Betty to come in and wait, which she did. 2 hours later, Betty was still waiting for her friend Lizzie to arrive, with worry and anxiety growing at each passing minute. Lizzie's aunt, uncle and Betty began to worry if maybe Lizzie had been the victim of a street accident owing to her being deaf in one ear, and so Betty said she would go and see if there was any sign of Lizzie. Betty then made her way to the offices on Hope Street where Lizzie was cleaning, hoping that maybe Lizzie had been held up for some reason. But when she got there, the offices were in darkness and the doors were locked. There was nothing to arouse Betty's suspicions when she peeped through the window, but she still had an uneasy feeling. She returned to Lizzie's aunt and uncle's home and told them that there was no sign of Lizzie, at which point Betty went home. Betty later said in a newspaper article that Lizzie had been her closest friend for years, and that when she had gone to Hope Street premises to look for Lizzie, everything had been in order, and there was absolutely no trace of any tragedy. Lizzie's aunt and uncle stayed up late on Saturday night, hoping that Lizzie would turn up, but they eventually went to bed for a restless night's sleep, telling themselves that Lizzie would be fine, that she had likely just forgotten she was going out with Betty and had visited other acquaintances and had decided to stay the night with them. However, by Sunday morning, there was still no sign of Lizzie, and when the friends Lizzie's aunt and uncle had thought she might have visited and stayed with on the Saturday night arrived at Lizzie's home to see her, telling Lizzie's aunt and uncle that they had not seen Lizzie at all on the Saturday night and that she had definitely not stayed with them, Lizzie's aunt and uncle's fears turned to alarm. Lizzie's uncle and Lizzie's brother, William, decided to firstly visit Hope Street again, just in case Lizzie was there, but again they found the doors locked and could see nothing amiss when they looked through the windows. And so, with a heavy heart, Lizzie's uncle went to the police station and told an officer about their concerns, saying that he was beginning to worry that maybe Lizzie had taken a seizure in the offices at Hope Street. Being quite a close-knit community, the keys to the Hope Street offices were immediately sought, and the police officer and Lizzie's uncle and brother made their way back to Hope Street. The police officer entered first, with Lizzie's uncle and brother following behind. Initially, everything appeared to be in order. Nothing was out of place, until the officer opened the door to an inner room and went inside. He immediately ushered Lizzie's uncle and brother back out of the premises and made a call to the central police station. Lizzie's body had been lying behind the door of this ground floor inner office. Her hands had been bound tightly in front of her with string, a ball of which was later found in the office. There was a handkerchief in her mouth, gagging her. She had abrasions under her chin and on her nose, and her head lay in a pool of blood, with it later being reported that she had been battered in the head with a round ebony ruler, so badly that her head was crushed. It was reported that Lizzie's body was in such a position that it could actually be seen through the window by passers-by when the police had lit up the premises, with her legs and feet protruding past the side of the typewriter desk that Lizzie's body was lying behind, which did surprise me as both Betty and Lizzie's uncle said they saw nothing when they peeped through the windows. But apparently the offices were so dark that it was almost impossible to see inside except when the lights were on. Following the constable making a call to the Central Police Station about Lizzie's body being found, according to an article in the Scotsman on the 1st of February 1932, the entire resources of the city's crime detection forces were on the scene within 15 minutes, including, for the first time, a microphotography expert, and Lizzie's body was photographed from every possible angle. A thorough examination of the premises were then undertaken, and a number of pieces of furniture were seen by the many people who had gathered to watch the proceedings to be removed and taken to the police station for closer scrutiny. Also taken from the scene was the suspected murder weapon, the heavy black ebony ruler, which was found under Lizzie's body and covered in blood. It was also reported that police had found hundreds of valuable fingerprints. However, after careful comparison to the fingerprints held on police file, no matches were found. Lizzie's body was eventually removed from the premises and examined by Professor John Glaister and the casualty surgeon at the Central Police Station, Dr. Kivlican, and Lizzie's death was estimated to have been between 6 and 7 p.m. on the Saturday night. It was felt, going by the evidence, that the attack on Lizzie would have taken place just as she was leaving the premises, as the offices were clean and tidy and all the cleaning equipment had been put away, suggesting that Lizzie had finished for the evening and was about to head home, likely having just opened the doors to leave when she had been pushed back inside by someone waiting outside. Lizzie was also wearing her outdoor coat and one glove when her body was found, and the keys to the premises were found lying near her head. It was also believed that Lizzie had put up a tremendous and likely unexpected fight, as a set of Lizzie's false teeth were also found on the floor near her, as well as a number of her hairpins, and she was found to be in a dishevelled state, suggesting a fierce struggle. It was believed that Lizzie had likely been bound and gagged first, before she then struggled to get to her feet to raise the alarm, and only then being struck repeatedly on the head. An article in the Dundee Courier was of the opinion that presumably Lizzie's assailant had merely intended to gag and bind her, but due to Lizzie putting up a tremendous fight, her assailant had been driven to a state of panic, and in this panic, he had seized the ruler and battered her over the head as she lay helpless. Now, I'm sure that this article didn't mean to suggest that Lizzie had been murdered because she had put up a fight, perhaps meaning that Lizzie's attacker hadn't brought a weapon with him and had just grabbed the heavy ruler as it was to hand, but it certainly read to me that they were suggesting Lizzie was somehow to blame. Now, while the police were busy thoroughly examining the premises where Lizzie's body was found, press representatives from the Scotsman were busy conveying to Lizzie's aunt and uncle the circumstances around Lizzie's death, as at that time they had only been told that she was dead. The press representatives then reported that Lizzie's aunt and uncle were extremely upset upon hearing this information. I don't know, they make it sound like they were doing a good thing by informing Lizzie's family of just how Lizzie had been killed. But was it out of the goodness of their heart, or was it more likely to get a story? I find I'm being very cynical in this episode. It's not really like me. So do tell me if I'm just reading things wrong, and you can see things from a different point of view. So following the police carrying out a thorough investigation of the ground floor offices, it was reported that robbery was likely the motive, as 2 cash boxes and a tin box had been taken from the safe in the office, the keys of which were in a desk drawer, and it was obvious that the thief or thieves had carried out a thorough search, as desk drawers and cupboards had been left open. The police were still trying to determine if it had been one man who had committed this crime, or whether there had been more at work, although early indications did appear to suggest that more than one person had been involved. The police were also considering whether this crime had been premeditated or whether it had just been a spur-of-the-moment crime. As the windows on the ground floor offices where Lizzie was cleaning were below street level, it was very easy to see straight into the premises when the lights were on, so someone walking past could have seen Lizzie working away and decided to enter the premises to see what they could find of value. However, Lizzie did clean these particular offices at the same time each week, so someone could have been planning to enter these premises for the purpose of robbery for some time. To try and ascertain who could have been behind this horrific murder, police appealed for anyone who had been around Hope Street on the Saturday afternoon to come forward if they had seen anyone loitering in the vicinity of the offices. The police were very hopeful of receiving a good amount of information, as Hope Street was a very busy street. On the other hand, they could also not understand how nobody heard Lizzie's cries for help, being as it was such a busy street. A witness did come forward, according to the Book of Glasgow Murders, written by Donald M. Fraser, to say that she had been walking along Hope Street about 5:30 p.m. on Saturday when she saw two men coming out of the offices where Lizzie was cleaning. She said they stopped momentarily to lock the doors behind them before walking off down Hope Street. She said one of the men was carrying a box about the size of a biscuit tin. This witness provided a description of these men, and an appeal was made for anyone with information about who these men could be to come forward. A large squad of CID men began another line of investigation while waiting for information to come in, by visiting and thoroughly combing lodging houses and poorer class hotels in the city in the hope of finding their culprit or culprits. Despite spending well into the early hours on this on the day Lizzie's body was found, they received no relevant information and no arrests were made. Not to worry though, as on Wednesday, the 3rd of February, 3 days after Lizzie's body was found, 3 men appeared in court, charged with Elizabeth Campbell's murder. But before that, on Tuesday the 2nd of February, it was reported in the Western Mail that both cash boxes that were missing from the scene had been found under a bush in Kelvin Grove Park by a young gardener who worked there. Initially, upon finding the cash boxes, this young gardener didn't associate them with Lizzie's murder, as it had not been disclosed by police at this time that the safe boxes had been taken from the offices, with police simply saying that nothing of value had been taken from the scene. But upon detectives arriving at the park to question people about Lizzie's murder, the gardener then put 2 and 2 together and informed the police of his find. The 2 cash boxes had contained national insurance cards and stamps, and the tin box had contained a total of 3 shillings and 3pence, about 15 pence or 20 cents in today's money. So a very small amount of cash. Due to this cash box being found and thought to have been discarded at the park that morning, sometime between 6:30 and 8 a.m, after the park employees came on duty, it was believed that Lizzie's attacker, or attackers, were still in the city. And it turns out they were. As, like I said, on Wednesday the 3rd of February, 3 days after Lizzie's body was found, 18-year-old George McCudden, 17-year-old Andrew Cameron and 20-year-old John Curtin appeared in court and were officially charged with having, on the 30th of January 1932, at the offices at Hope Street, assaulted Elizabeth Dodds McGill Campbell and seized hold of her, beat her on the face and head with their fists, knocked her down, bound her, gagged her, and beat her on the head with an ebonite ruler, and murdered her, and of stealing 2 cash boxes and a tin box containing national insurance cards, stamps, and 3 shillings and 3pence. The 3 pleaded not guilty and were remanded in custody. However, on the 18th of April 1932, day 1 of the murder trial, only 19-year-old George McCudden and 18-year-old Andrew Allison Cameron appeared at Glasgow High Court on trial for Elizabeth Campbell's murder and of having burgled the offices at Hope Street, with Judge Lord Blackburn presiding. So what had changed that only 2 men were now on trial for Elizabeth Campbell's murder? Well, I'll get to that, as first there was a bit of drama upon the jury being selected for this trial. According to the Book of Glasgow Murders, the defence teams for both George McCudden and Andrew Cameron objected to the 8 women that had been selected to serve on the jury, using up all of the 8 challenges they were allowed. A further female was then selected to serve. However, as she would have been the only female on the jury, the judge said that if she wanted, she could be excused from serving, and the woman accepted this offer, and therefore another male was selected to serve instead, meaning the jury consisted of 15 men. Obviously, the defence teams thought having any women on the jury might sway the decision-making against their clients. But would having an all-male jury help the defence? Okay, so before we hear about who took to the stand at the trial and what they had to say, first let me tell you how Elizabeth's killers were caught, as well as why there were now only 2 men on trial for Elizabeth's murder instead of the 3 who had originally been charged. Well, it all started with an anonymous note being received by Detective Superintendent John Forbes, who was leading the murder inquiry, on the Tuesday after Lizzie's body had been found. The note was very short and simply said that, if you question the boy McCudden, who works in the offices on Hope Street, you may find out something in connection with the Hope Street murder. George McCudden had already been questioned by police, as he actually worked on Mondays and Tuesdays in the Farquharson brothers' office, the same office where Lizzie was attacked and murdered, and he had apparently given a satisfactory account of his movements. Upon receiving this anonymous letter, Detective Superintendent John Forbes again visited George McCudden to question him, and he was actually at work in the same offices where Lizzie had been murdered. George McCudden was taken to the police office and again questioned, before being arrested and formally charged with Elizabeth Campbell's murder, at which point he allegedly made a voluntary statement in reply to this charge, which read, "I did not mean to do anything to her. I tried to keep her quiet, but did not mean to hurt her or cause blood. It is a pity for wee Andy Moffat." This was apparently a name that Andrew Cameron was also known by. The alleged statement by George McCudden went on to say, "He meant no harm. I wish I'd not told Burney." This man Burney would go on to be a witness for the Crown. The alleged statement apparently ended with, "He must have squealed. It was only done on the spur of the moment. I would not do it again, but I wanted money." So that was the confession the police needed, and what led Detective John Montgomery then going to Andrew Cameron's house to arrest him, with detectives believing him also to be involved, as George McCudden had alleged in his statement. Upon Andrew Cameron being arrested and formally charged with Elizabeth Campbell's murder, he apparently said, "That's right, but we did not mean to kill her." During George McCudden being questioned, he also mentioned the name John Curtin as also having some involvement, and so he too was visited at home and arrested and charged with Elizabeth's murder. Following all 3 men being remanded in custody until the murder trial, according to the Book of Glasgow Murders, both George McCudden and Andrew Cameron made statements saying that John Curtin had played no part in the murder and that he had only been the lookout, staying outside the offices at all times, and that he had been unaware any violence had been used. Following this, John Curtin was released from prison and all charges against him were dropped, at which point he then became the prosecution's chief witness, going on to give damning evidence against both George McCudden and Andrew Cameron at the trial. Okay, so back to the trial, and first to take to the stand was the lead detective in the murder inquiry, who told the jury, according to the Book of Glasgow Murders, that Elizabeth Campbell had been struck on the head and face almost 20 times, that her glasses had been broken and torn from her face, and that her false teeth had been knocked from her mouth. Lizzie's post-mortem results were then read out, and according again to the Book of Glasgow Murders, Lizzie had died due to shock and heart failure, which had been brought on by the severe injuries she had sustained to her head and face, and due to the amount of blood she had lost. It was reported that on some parts of Lizzie's face there were clear boot or shoe indentations, suggesting she had been kicked extremely hard. There were 11 separately recorded blows to Lizzie's face, and a further 7 wounds or injuries to her head and skull area. It was stated that these injuries could not have been caused by Lizzie merely falling over. Then taking to the stand was 20-year-old John Curtin. He stated that on Wednesday evening, days before Elizabeth Campbell was murdered, he and George McCudden and Andrew Cameron were together in a billiards room, and George and Andrew began talking about their plan to enter the offices on Hope Street, with George saying that the lady who cleaned the offices on the Saturday was stone deaf, so she wouldn't cause them any problems, that they could hide until she left, before then turning to John Curtin and asking him to watch cop, which apparently meant to look out for the police. John said that he agreed, and on the Saturday afternoon, he, George and Andrew went to the building where the offices were located on Hope Street and began walking around and around for a long period of time, taking different routes so they would not create suspicion. John Curtin said at this point that he became frightened and told George and Andrew that he no longer wanted to watch cop, and then he left. Apparently, he met up with Andrew Cameron later on the Saturday evening, at which point Andrew told John that both he and George McCudden had done the job, going on to tell John that the woman who was cleaning the offices, Lizzie, had flown at them when they entered the building and had put up a terrible fight. Andrew Cameron then apparently showed John his sleeves, which had blood on them, and he told John that the blood had come from the cleaning woman's head, before advising John that they had managed to steal 3 shillings. John clarified that while Andrew didn't say what had been done to the woman, Andrew apparently did say that she had been quite comfortable when they left her. John then went on to say that he had also seen George McCudden later the same evening, again at a billiards room, and that George had shown John his left hand, which John said had been badly swollen, and George told John that this was due to the cleaning woman in the office having bitten him so hard that her false teeth had fallen out. George apparently went on to tell John that he had struck this woman with a mallet and a ruler to quieten her, and that he had also put his handkerchief in her mouth. John Curtin was then asked what his movements were the next day, to which John replied that he and Andrew Cameron, along with another boy named Matthew McCann, had walked down Hope Street to sell newspapers, and as they were passing the window of the office where the attack on Lizzie had taken place the previous night, John said that the boy Matthew McCann had looked in and said, "Oh, she is dead," but apparently he was joking. He said that Andrew Cameron also looked through the window, and his reply to Matthew McCann's comment was, "She must be away. She is not there." John said that he didn't react to either comment or look in the window, as he didn't want to be involved with what had taken place. On John Curtin being cross-examined, it was suggested to him that he himself had actually dared George McCudden to do a job, as in carry out a robbery, but John denied this, going on to say that George McCudden had talked to him once or twice about robberies, but he had just thought George was bragging or making these stories up. Matthew McCann also took to the stand and confirmed what George Curtin had said, adding that when he had met John Curtin later on the Saturday evening and asked him how the job had gone, John Curtin had replied, "There were too many policemen about." He went on to say that he had seen Andrew Cameron the day before the murder and said that Andrew had told him that he, George McCudden and George Curtin planned to do a job on the morrow, with Matthew saying he believed they meant to break into a shop to steal money. He advised that he had also seen Andrew Cameron on the evening of the murder, at which point Andrew confirmed the job had gone ahead by apparently saying that they had bound and gagged a woman and had managed to steal cash boxes, and that upon opening them they had only found 3 shillings, with Andrew apparently being disgusted by this fact. Matthew went on to say that he hadn't believed what Andrew had said about attacking the woman, despite Andrew showing Matthew his sleeves with blood on them. When Matthew was asked if Andrew had confirmed the blood belonged to the woman he had apparently bound and gagged, Matthew replied no. Matthew went on to advise that he had also seen George McCudden on the Saturday evening, again in a billiards room, and that George had told him that he and Andrew had jumped at the woman and brought her down, with George saying that he had clubbed her 2 or 3 times over the head. When Matthew was asked what George said Andrew had done, Matthew replied that George had told him Andrew had tied up the woman and gagged her to prevent her from screaming. George also confirmed that there had been blood coming from the woman's head after the blows. George also apparently told Matthew that after the attack, he had gone over the premises with his handkerchief to remove all traces of fingerprints, which was strange considering the police said they had found hundreds of fingerprint impressions at the scene. In the Book of Glasgow Murders, it is stated that Matthew McCann had actually received a share of the postage stamps found in the cash boxes given to him by George McCudden, and that Matthew had also been arrested due to this, although following him handing over the stamps to the police, he had been released from custody. Another witness to take to the stand for the prosecution was a man named John Alexander Burney, a spirit salesman, whose evidence proved to be quite dramatic. he had apparently also been at the billiards room on the Saturday evening, and he too had seen George McCudden there, and he knew both George and Andrew quite well. He said that he too was shown the swollen left hand of George McCudden, but George apparently told him that he had been in a fight in the Hope Street offices where he worked when he had gone there to get some money, but that the cleaner had been there and had challenged him, so he had struck her, gave her a good hiding, gagged her and left her. John Burney said that he didn't take him too seriously, as nearly everything that came out of George McCudden's mouth was American gangster stuff. The trial lasted 3 days, where numerous other witnesses took to the stand for the prosecution, all placing both George McCudden and Andrew Cameron on Hope Street, outside or near the offices where Lizzie was found murdered, on the afternoon of her murder, before the prosecution then summed up, saying that the two youths charged with Elizabeth Campbell's murder showed a degree of callousness so incredible that even the associates of the boys refused to believe the story they were telling about Elizabeth's attack and murder, ending by saying that there was absolutely no justification for the argument the defence had put forward, that the accused were not normal in their intelligence. Both George McCudden and Andrew Cameron were examined by a professor while in custody awaiting trial, and they were found to be perfectly normal and competent, and that they exhibited absolutely no evidence of any mental abnormality. 3 witnesses were called for the defence: George McCudden's sister, his scoutmaster, and the chief medical officer at the prison George had been held at. The jury then retired for 50 minutes before returning with their verdict. So what do you think? Having listened to the evidence and heard what they had apparently done to Elizabeth, do you think the all-male jury would have compassion for the 2 youths and return any other verdict than guilty? No, they didn't. George McCudden and Andrew Cameron were found guilty of murdering Elizabeth Campbell by a majority, and they were sentenced to death, although the jury had recommended that they receive clemency. Judge Lord Blackburn, however, told the accused not to attach too much importance to the jury's recommendation, as they had carried out a most brutal and callous murder. He then fixed their execution for the 11th of May 1932 in Glasgow. It was reported in the Daily Mirror after the trial that both of the accused had listened with perfect composure as Lord Blackburn sentenced them to death, and that they had maintained a stoic calm throughout the trial. Perhaps the two had a feeling that they wouldn't be executed, as within days of them being found guilty and sentenced to death, a public petition was in full force, with tables being set up in several places in the Cowcaddens district of the city, where not only George McCudden and Andrew Cameron had resided, but also where Elizabeth Campbell and her family resided, and members of the public were encouraged to sign the petition to reprieve Elizabeth's killers. Now, I'm not a fan of executions, but I'm not sure how I would have felt if I had been Elizabeth's family members, seeing the scramble to get reprieve for 2 people who had without thought or care brutally killed one of my family members, especially as it had been reported in the Scotsman that Elizabeth had been well known in the district, and that great sympathy had been expressed to her relatives by the community for the tragedy of Elizabeth's murder. However, both George McCudden and Andrew Cameron received a reprieve 2 days before their execution date, with the petition being signed by almost 60,000 people, and they were instead sentenced to penal servitude for life. And that was the murder case of the shy, timid, and always obliging Elizabeth Lizzie Campbell, murdered all for the grand sum of 3 shillings and 3d. As usual, I used the British Newspaper Archive for most of my research into this case. You can find all of the resources I used for this episode by visiting scottishmurders.com/Elizabeth Campbell, and the link will be in the show notes. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of the episodes coming up, including our live recording at Airdrie Library about the murder of Aileen Printy in 1981, and possibly a more detailed episode about the murder of George Martin Nixon in 1970, a case I slightly touched on in a previous Scotland Then episode. So thanks for listening to another episode of Scottish Murders. I've been your host, Dawn.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.